All right. So thank you all for joining. This is the TM Bomb feature working group. Looks like we are having Izar join us. Presence. Hey, Izar.
Howdy.
Hello.
Hello.
The I don't think we went down the categories route last time we talked, and I know that's still a backlog item for Kim. What does the group want to work on today? I know we talked a little bit about since the categories are not ready, one of the topics that we considered was starting just to POC this out. Actually, okay, we got a positive reaction from Izar.
I have a show and tell. I have a show and tell.
You have a show and tell. You want to
Oh, demo time.
yay. You want to
So let's
share?
see if this is going to work. So we've been talking for a long time about what happens when we get when we get the tools to talk to each other. So I got something sorry, very simple here. So this is the output of PyTM right now. I just added one more field that says system importance, just temporary name, totally out there, nothing major. And in the source files, I have what I consider to be the source files for that particular element, which of course is something that only happens after the coding starts. And in here you have example library. And then I took a sample SBOM that has component information about example library and vulnerabilities. And a very short script that cross between both things, so that this can go and take the fact that there are vulnerabilities in the example library, cross it with the fact that the system is considered critical from a threat model point of view, and order the number of findings, so that somebody looking at the vulnerabilities has one more piece of data to base for their prioritization.
That's awesome.
So it just illustrates the idea of closing that loop, that you do the TM, you start developing, you feed the TM with the names of the files that are implementing the things that got defined in the TM. And then after you have the whole cycle down the road where you have vulnerabilities for those components, they go back and refer to the threat model and get some enrichments.
So
awesome.
I know you didn't have it in your demo, but have you looked at maybe using the SBOM to feed the threat model? In other words, validate that what's in the SBOM is ends up in the
Not
threat
yet.
model?
That's the top part of the loop that I haven't gotten to yet.
Mhm.
I just wanted to put something together just to illustrate what we've been talking about,
So
because
this
we've been
is
moving the hands in the air a lot.
this is merging the documentations, right? Or is
The,
there something else?
It's not quite merging, it's cross-relating,
Yeah,
trying to figure as much information as you can
right.
to lead someone to prioritize what to fix first.
Yeah.
And you're doing that primarily by string match, right? It looks like
Yes.
right now. Okay.
Yes, right now it's string match. Although once there is a repo in place, PyTM has the ability of going into the directory and checking the files themselves and stuff like that, but that's for going forward.
Got it. No, that's really interesting. We should think about as we're going through this effort, we should probably think about documenting some of the I don't want to say case studies, but some of the real world examples, this being like one of them, and actually showing some tools that are actually doing this, right?
Right now, I don't think that there is any.
Exactly. And then but promoting that stuff on YouTube or all the socials and that sort of thing. That way we can kind of because I mean threat modeling itself it's a hard enough thing to convince organizations to do anyway. And if you can start demonstrating more and more and more value that we're trying to innovate on, I think that will help a lot
But
of our causes.
To tell you the truth, I think that before we get into the actual tools that do things, I think that we have to have a bit of a ground laying work in terms of what are the responsibilities of tools in terms of generating that data and enriching the other sources of data. So, for example, the issue of the source files. So, by definition, a threat modeling tool should not have any dependency or knowledge on source files. There are some tools that are able to scan a repo and come up with a suggestion of a threat model where people can start interacting with. And those things are not exact by any ways or means. On the other side, a vulnerability scanner that generates an SBOM and a list of vulnerabilities should not know anything about the elements that appear in the threat model. So are we talking about tools that reach out, get all the possible SBOMs that they have access to and start bringing data together? Or are we talking about the third thing that creates a mapping between what is defined in the threat model, what is defined on the code scan, and tries to marry those things together?
And if I may, that's one area where it might be a good exercise to do, is go through the various structures, right? The various X or star bomb structures, and identify fields or information that relate to each other, right?
Totally.
Based on the example you just gave, right, was you had a threat model that had a thing, and that thing had a reference in another, in an SBOM, right, or in a VEX definition. And if you said this field and this field and this field are all related, now you have a start of an information model that you can then start firming for data.
Yeah,
Exactly.
for sure.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I was hoping we could going back to like modeling what it is, the type of information that we want to capture, right, in CycloneDX format. Going back to the type of information that we want to capture, as we've discussed, historically throughout all of our previous meetings, I would like to actually dive into how we would actually start capturing that, like actually working on the model itself. The CycloneDX already has the ability to link to different files, right? In a serialization agnostic way. So theoretically, if we had like a threat model represented in Cyclone, and we had maybe an SBOM or a SASBOM or whatever, we could link these things together so they are separation of concerns is maintained. And I would like to kind of explore how we would actually start modeling the things that we actually discussed. All right, we talked a little bit about architecture. We could start there. We talked a little bit about representing weaknesses and threats. Start there, because Cyclone doesn't do that today. It only does vulnerabilities. There's a lot of different things that we can start. We just can't start on some of the taxonomy stuff because it's not complete yet.
Yeah, so what I can do is, again, show what PyTM is doing nowadays. Let me know if this is sort of where you wanted to take this. So very simply, in here we have the assets, right? The class, all the details about what you need in order to do all the threat modeling considerations. And this is enough to describe a single element. Eventually, as we said, you can go down to the source files granularity, but again, not quite a threat modeling thing. And all these attributes, at least for PyTM, are dynamic. You can add attributes whenever you want. So that would mean that the whole definition becomes a bit more dynamic. There's no versioning. Everybody does whatever they want to match how they use PyTM in their organization. So there might be a need for a bit of standardization in here. But once that happens and you have your threat model already figured out, another element is the trust boundaries. So what are the boundaries between, what are the boundaries between different zones, between different containers, right? And no, these are the data flows, sorry. The boundaries are here. So you know the controls over a boundary, and you know the classification, you know if there's TLS in there, you know what the name of the boundary is. So that's enough to define a container where you can put elements. Controls, assumptions.
Do those controls map to things like ASVS, or is that just kind of free-flowing JSON properties?
Right now, they're free-flowing properties. They are the description of the controls in terms that PyTM can understand.
But they represent mitigation techniques for threats, right? So what is our, I guess, to flesh this out a bit more, right? Each element, each object, well, element, asset, whatever in PyTM has a set of attributes and potentially a set of controls, right? So a server or a server or a client or another element object will have a set of attributes, things about it, and a set of controls, things that it does or that it has implemented, which can be used to make judgment calls in terms of what threats may apply, right? So the rule system to make, as is our showing here, line 1588, is making use of an object and its controls to know that it sanitizes input and that it has object encoding, right? So that may mitigate, if it doesn't have those things, then it would have a threat. So that each object has attributes and controls associated to them. Those controls are based on the set of threats that were farmed over the X number of years that PyTM has been created to what you need to look for to identify if a threat exists, right? And Izar, do you want to show the data flows that connect objects together?
So here you have a data flow that connects the database to the secret database. You can specify the protocol, port, what kind of data goes over the data flow, of course, an explanation, and the classification in terms of top secret, secret, classified, sensitive, whatever. But we were talking about the actual findings being created because CycloneDX doesn't have a representation of that. So whenever PyTM finds something, we have, as Matt said, a set of rules that leads to a set of threats that have been defined. If the rule is true, then the threat becomes a finding. And then you have the description. We do not do CVSS right now. We have a field, but we don't do any kind of calculation. Description, details, working example, and the suggestion for mitigations, as well as the references. We thought that anything more than this would be fluff, and anything less than this would not give people operational information to actually do something about the finding.
Right. I think the level of granularity here is pretty good, actually. It's at the right level of detail, I think. I had a question on your assets array. You had, I think, an inputs in your assets array, I think.
Yes.
Can you expand upon that?
So these are the data flows that come into the asset. So we have a data flow that's named user enters comments. So in here, it would be this data flow here.
Got it. Okay. All right.
and it goes between the user and the web server.
And
Got
I guess this is, I'll just register a comment here that, because this is, this is something I've been looking at actually for us to think about for an expansion. You'll note that this data flow establishes that there's an inbound connection coming into an asset. What the asset doesn't describe is that it exposes a port, that it exposes a service, right? So the data flow describes that there's an inbound connection, not that the asset itself exposes an inbound connection.
Yeah.
And that's a potential pitfall that folks have to get used to when using PyTM. And by the way, it's not unique to PyTM. That's how the Microsoft threat modeling tool works. For example, you don't describe an object having an import port. You describe the object having a data flow connecting to it.
Right.
We do have a provision for ports in here, but we are not looking for anything more specific. It's just you could say a placeholder nowadays.
And right now, the port list is actually a port number, but no, not a list of ports and a connection of other objects. But that's maybe a future enhancement.
Yep. Which would lead, for example, for us being able to check a firewall configuration based on this, things like that.
Right. One other thing to highlight, actually, Steve, maybe for this conversation, is levels. You see there 170 is levels. Remember, think about traditional threat modeling where you do sort of a context diagram, and you may have a level 1, level 2. Basically, as you decompose the system further and further, PyTM allows for a set of levels for when the rendering is done. So PyTM does the threat analysis, but it also does the rendering of the model. You can say what levels, the defaults to 0, but you can tell what levels you want the rendering to be done on.
I see. All right. So think of like a stacked kind of diagram type of thing with layers.
Sort of, yes. Although we don't overlay. I guess traditionally threat modeling, you would draw. You have your context diagram where you have your object of under an evaluation sort of in the middle, and then you'd have sort of the connected systems, and then you would decompose that thing in the middle into its representative parts, right? In a different diagram.
See. Okay, got it. Okay, I understand. Okay. All right. Is those sample files available, Izar?
Nope. Work in progress.
Can you make them available?
Nope. Work in progress.
Okay.
So I got a branch on PyTM that I'm working on just to make this thing a bit more clear. Right now, the PyTM script itself, the element itself, doesn't have the fields that I added into the JSON directly. So I have to add those. I have to add them to the tests. I have to do the whole framework thing.
Right.
And after that, I'm going to check in.
Okay. All right. Because ideally, again, for interoperability, we want to be able to capture pretty much everything that PyTM would need, along with all the other threat modeling tools, right?
Yeah.
Davichi, Aries Risk, etc. Okay.
Well, all of these things are compatible, I think, if you look at, you have a thing, that thing has a set of properties, and you can nest, as long as you can nest those properties, all of those can be represented.
Right. So what is available right now for PyTM? Because it is a holiday in the US, and I'm going to try to make use of that fact.
So if you go to, where's the chat in this thing? Why do they keep moving things around here? HTTPS.
Let's see. I'm at your GitHub repo right now.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm already at your repo. I just wanted to know if there's a complete sample here. There's the code with the data.
Yeah, you have the tm.py. That's the sample.
Okay, all right. But no JSON.
And there is a JSON in there. It
Is there?
corresponds to the TMPY, but you can create it from TMPY at any
Oh,
time.
okay. All right.
And the documentation is complete these days.
I'll go with
Ish.
99%.
There's an open issue, I know, but it's mostly complete.
Is documentation ever complete?
Hopefully the attributes, Steve, hopefully the attributes and the controls are self-explanatory by their name. They're usually pretty descriptive to a fault in some cases.
Yeah.
But
And if
most
they're
of them
not,
have-
assume worst case.
yeah.
Where did the list of controls come from? Did you reference an authoritative list somewhere? Like I mentioned ASVS earlier. Are you just kind of adding them as you need them?
I think they came about from, so the original threat list was identified using KPAC, so using the common
Okay.
attack patterns. And so
Okay.
the controls, many of the common controls that would be in place, you know, like using TLS or using other secure communications or having various configuration options, sort of sprung up from that, right? How would you mitigate the weakness or vulnerability or attack? So
Okay.
nothing authoritative in that regard. And this is just throwing it out there. This has led to some confusion, and things have evolved over time. I think we've gotten a pretty good place. Although I think we still have a confusion between an attribute and a control being overlapping. We can talk about that
Yep.
later. There's an open issue for that. But otherwise, they come about because of right. How do you mitigate a vulnerability, or how do you mitigate a threat based on industry practice?
Right. Okay. All right.
And I guess just in that context, it's also important to highlight, just full disclosure here, right, that we're looking, PyTM currently looks at per element and or per interact. Well, it does some interaction, but not full interaction.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for more complex analysis,
We go over every data flow, but it's a shallow search in terms that you only see the endpoints. You don't go beyond that.
but even still, the analysis really is only looking at the data flow and maybe the target in that case. So it's only a partial analysis of the flow. It's the flow and the endpoint, at least one of the endpoints, even though we do index sort of the source and the destination.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Is
Do you
there a
have these
distinction
controls
between-
only on the assets or on the data flows as well? Because if the data flows from A to B, something could happen to the data, and it should be
Yeah. So
like
the data flows are assets or elements, right? So they're all subclass, and therefore
Right.
controls apply to the data flows, and I think are to the data too, if I remember
Yes.
correctly. Or is that
I don't remember if we have any rule that looks at the data beyond classification.
but it does exist. It's possible, even if we don't
It's
have any rules
possible.
for it.
It's possible.
Data as an object that has the ability to have controls. Data
Yes.
flows can have controls and attributes, and endpoints or objects can as well.
Mhm.
So the flexibility is there. It's just not being implemented at this point.
Is
Okay,
Yeah.
the
so the
distinction between
data, I see a classification, like classification public here in the sample. What we do in our models is then when we have data, we say what happens if confidentiality is breached or availability is breached or the CIA things. We have them separately. Would this be possible in that model?
That would be threats that would be identifiable, right? So you would potentially have a threat that you could define, and keep in mind, users can define threats, right? They can take what PyTM provides, which isn't a ton, and then extend it, right? So in theory, and I say in theory because I don't think we've written these, but it should be possible to say if these properties of a data over a data flow, if certain properties exist, you may have an exposure of confidentiality, and then you flag that as a threat.
And that's exactly what I mean, I think. So what we do is say if confidentiality is breached, then we have a level 1 to 5. 1 is, well, we can deal with it easily, and 5 is it's an essential problem for
Yeah,
our
you're talking
company.
about
The same
mitigation
for the other
or
two.
response.
Impact.
Yeah, impact.
Impact, exactly.
But that's just how to document the findings, no? That hasn't
Yeah.
anything to do with these
Yeah.
attributes or controls? Or
But
am I?
again, we could add an impact attribute to the data element and start putting.
Well, actually, Isar, can you bring up finding? Actually, so can you go back and share and bring up finding? Because we do the finding itself has a lot of information. Well, some information, right? And I think what's important that's being called out here is there's the finding and a mitigation, but what you really are looking for is the impact of so what, right?
Yeah.
And maybe some intelligence about that, which today isn't implemented, but there's no reason it couldn't be, right? It's extensible in that regard. So,
Exactly.
Is the
so this is the
finding
rule. This is the rule, not the finding, right? Or is that
This
finding?
no, this is the finding itself.
This is the finding itself, the full
Yeah, it just
structure.
yes, it just lists
Yeah, okay.
the. But wait, if you want to see the finding file itself, the thread file itself,
is the
that
finding
what you wanted?
tied to an asset or a data flow, or how is this associated?
Give me just 1 second to load something here, and I'll show you. Thread lib, threads.js. So in here you see that, where is it? Target ID. So this specific instance of the finding is tied to this target.
So that's an object in the file that's being used. There's a web server object that was implemented or that was defined.
Which is this one.
Can
What
you combine or something? I mean, or have an overarching thread? I don't know if that's always that relevant, but I can.
What do you mean overarching?
No. I'm thinking about no, never mind. I'm thinking about
Remember
I don't want to read this, but we're not reading this, we're using this to
right.
Yeah.
to read and to process.
Remember our analysis is on a per object or per data flow basis,
yeah,
so not on a per model basis.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get at is, I don't know if you're trying to get at the same thing, Kim, or not, but Linden has this concept of linking
Mhm.
as a threat category where you might necessarily have a vulnerability in like 3 different things, but if you can combine the output from 3 different things, you can actually link data to like an individual, for example, and
Mhm.
those combination of those 3 things are then tied to that one finding.
Yeah, the threat rules that we have today and the threat analysis approach probably cannot do that as implemented right now. I will go out on a limb. I think Izar, you'll agree with this, because it looks at targets, because it evaluates on a per target basis, meaning it looks at each element. To do cross-object analysis that you're looking
Oh,
for.
no. For that, we need a graph database and we need to get all sorts of smart.
So that's a
Yeah,
bit more
I'm not
advanced.
even talking about the automation, but yeah, for instance, having the different data items for a target that lead to a specific linking or identifying threat might be useful here. But that's the privacy extension. So
Yeah, I mean
we are gonna talk about it at some point, but that's not like
yeah, we do need to talk about it at some point, and believe me, we've been thinking about it. But the cross object analysis and the cross flow analysis is a bit beyond where we're at.
Yeah, but it's not even
today.
cross object or cross flow. It can be in this database. For these specific types of data, we have this specific privacy threat. Instead of having just there's a linking thread for the database, it can be for these specific types or for these specific individuals, or like more attributes for a specific threat or specific finding.
If you can describe a data object that has certain properties, you could write a rule as it indexes through this data has these properties and this threat can exist regardless of where it lives. Although in theory you could maybe associate it lives in this database, and therefore there's no hierarchy in that regard. So you can't say, I don't think there's actually, keep me honest here. There's no way to say this data lives in a database within a boundary that has certain properties.
Wait, to say that or to extract that knowledge from what's being said?
To use that in a rule.
Oh. You could, for example, look at data as a target. Then it would say carried by.
Right.
Carried by would take you to a data flow.
So it's a bit more
Uh,
complex rule.
Yeah,
That
a
could,
data
it could be
flow
written. Yeah.
A data flow would give you a target and a source, and then you could make questions about those two. So it's doable. It's not a one-liner.
Is
There is a. Okay, Steve.
I
Yeah,
just go ahead.
go.
Or Kim.
I just had a basic question is, and this is so elementary, but I think it's important to understand, at least for me. Is a finding in this format, is a finding the same as a threat, or are they different things?
A threat is a finding in potential. A finding is a threat that has been realized.
Excuse me?
A threat is an instance of a finding. But
So
it's
the
an
threat
instance
has
that's
been
been proven to,
realized.
yes.
Okay.
But I think more fundamentally for what you're asking, a finding appears when a rule has been evaluates to true. All the
Got it.
rules currently in PyTM are threats or attacks.
Right, exactly.
If you were to implement a rule that describes a vulnerability, you could have a finding which is a vulnerability. Again, recognized because the condition evaluates the true in the model.
Yes. Okay. Got it. No, that's an important nuance to understand. Okay. Got it. Kim, you had a question?
Yeah, no, I was just, because we were talking about the data and stuff, we have been talking about the different data items in one of the previous meetings. I might, like, offline, let's sync to see if that kind of aligns with what you're doing in PyTM, with that works. I know you've been wanting to do the privacy extension longer. Maybe this is the moment to do it.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's not like we have anything else in the works, so we have plenty of time.
You have time, like tomorrow.
No,
you have all the time.
we really been wanting to do the move to a graph database for a while now. But every time that I put a block of time aside to do that, that block of time gets demolished by something else. So as soon as the world stops having emergencies, I'll get right to it.
But so for the TM bomb, is this the starting point? Do we need to reference it with other tools? Did you ever look at the other ones? How to?
No, because they're crap. Basically, PyTM is the only tool that actually counts.
Well, I didn't want to say,
But
yeah.
This isn't made. This isn't going to be made public, is it?
No, it's just recorded.
But no, like with all the love that I have for those tools, and they are definitely not crap. The only one that we've been talking with has been Threat Dragon, and basically because they are the GUI level version of PyTM, it's the introductory thing, just for people to start getting acquainted with threat modeling, rather than one of the big tools. So the idea was to figure out how this would work here. And then much like OTM was done, use the good offices of CycloneDX to say, okay, this is the TM-Bone first version of a format. Now you big boys go crazy on it.
And we have to assume, I mean, if you look at the Microsoft Threatline tool or Threat Dragon, they have a pretty similar structure for a lot of this, right? These are not brand new concepts. They're just maybe called something different, or they have other constraints, right? And so as long as the format and structure that we come up with has flexibility, right? So it's not a rigid structure, but it allows for nesting, it allows for potentially even cross-referencing or linking, then we should be capable of addressing most variations as they appear. I know, for instance, that I can take Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool rules from a TB7 file and make an equivalent in PyTM with some constraints. So as long as we have flexibility in that regard, and I haven't tried it. I haven't tried to go to OTM with that, but it should, in theory, be possible. So as long as we have that flexibility of not providing artificial constraints on what is possible or what is necessary, we should be in a good position. And I think the other, XBOM things that CycloneDX already support that kind of nesting or structure.
Yeah.
What you
they
don't
do.
get is like, you don't get an XPath reference or anything like that because it's JSON, right? I'm not sure what a JSON reference looks like these days, but
Dot field dot. It's actually cleaner than XPath.
When do you think, I would love to use this for inspiration, Izar, in mocking up something for CycloneDX. When do you think you'll have something checked into that branch?
Oh, real soon now.
Okay.
Anytime now.
Okay.
Like
I'm not buying
between 15 minutes from now and 2028. Anytime now. No, seriously. Now that this proves somewhat useful, I think that while I was playing here, I noticed that there's a bug in the JSON file format, and it could be much simplified. So I'm probably going to look at that first, propose the change to the rest of the PyTM team. And if we don't consider it a breaking change, then we move that way. And then it's just adding the system importance field or figuring out a better name for it. And then it should be usable. As it is right now, apart from the system importance thing, if you just run your PyTM script with --JSON and the file name, you're going to get this representation. So
Right.
if you want to start playing with it, you could do it right now.
Okay.
Just make sure that whatever addition you do it in the JSON file and not in the PyTM because it's not going to be reflected.
Yeah, I've been trying to I've got a spreadsheet that I started a long time ago, and I was looking at the output from Pasta, or I'm sorry, Fork. I was looking at the output from Irius Risk and Davichi and Threat Dragon, and I haven't dived into to PyTM yet. But I'm trying to capture like all the different types of data and how they're represented, because there's been some interesting design decisions in some of these tools. Good or bad, interesting. But I'm trying to capture like all the different types of data that we would need to capture in a format that could allow for interoperability. So I'd like to be able to document the fields in PyTM. And
let me see. JSON -5 for JSON.
one thing I don't have is probably the Microsoft tool, because I haven't
You're
used
not
Windows
missing
in a
anything.
really long time.
you can actually download the sample Microsoft threat modeling tool templates. I'll see if I can find the repository while we're talking.
Okay. Okay.
And I just looked in here, and actually, if you wait, let me reload this thing here. So if you take the sample tm.py script and you add any new field to the elements, then that's going to appear in the JSON when you save it.
Okay.
You won't be able to, like, there's no validation or anything, but the JSON that gets produced, it's going to be valid.
Okay. All right. I'll start there then.
Yeah, so you can play with that.
Okay.
And did you say something about Fork as a tool?
Yeah.
Fork?
Do you have a link to that? Because I can't. If you look for pasta fork, you don't.
Oh,
You find
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, Adam says you guys know how to pick up great names.
Oh yeah. It's forktm.com.
Fork TM. Wow, that's just okay.
And so some of the things that I thought were interesting, because it's very question based. But some of the things that
found it.
that I thought were interesting was just being able to capture like use cases.
Oh,
And
you
some of
have
the
to
more
sign up.
basic things. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not signing up.
There's a GitHub repository. I put in
Uh,
the chat as well.
Thank you. Oh, it's the Versprite thing. Okay.
Yeah, I would never have found it.
Okay.
There's no way.
But if we're going to be, methodology agnostic and support threat modeling, no matter Stride, Pasta, Linden, whatever, we need to just say yes. We need to support it no matter how you're approaching.
So
but
that's actually an important. Oh, go ahead.
no,
Sorry,
no,
actually.
just 1 second before we go into that. Just to play forward how the conversation is going to go. Whenever we put out something that focuses on the model and on the threats and on the findings themselves, there is going to be a very big conversation around, but where's the risk management information? We can do risk management if the risk management for threat modeling is not risk management.
Right.
So that show and tell that I did in the beginning, that to me is the idea of the loop between the threat model and the actual vulnerabilities in the code that leads you to do risk management. But
Correct.
threat modeling itself is not risk management. So let's put that as a founding stone of what we're trying to do here, because that conversation will come faster than
I think we're on the same page. Yes.
cool.
And I guess the point I wanted to raise was that tools like, especially PyTM and any of the other tools that we've talked about, with the exception of Fork, I guess, is agnostic of that methodology, right? PyTM itself does not implement Stride. It uses a lot of the same structures of Stride, as an example, but Stride is just a category system of threats, not even a methodology for applying it, right? Whether you're doing the 4-question framework, you're doing Pasta, or you're doing, and those are competing methodologies. The tools are independent of that. They may enforce certain structures, as I mentioned. They may have capabilities for additional things like, threat intelligence and risk management, or connection to actual code, or other, threat intel databases or other things. But those are secondary to the process of strictly doing modeling and threat analysis,
right,
independent of your methodology.
Yep. Got it. No, that's good to know too. Yeah, because I do not want to reinvent. I do not want to come up with a specification for risk management or GRC or any of this kind of stuff. No.
Yeah, and in fact, the tools should none of the tools and none of the structures you're talking about should be enforcing workflow.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I am here, because we have in our company, we use a very special methodology. We made up ourselves, but when I look, for example, at Open Threat Model, the results would fit in there. And it's completely agnostic of the methodology we use. And so this will be the interesting thing. Could we use the results of our model? Could we get it in a threat model in a CycloneDX then in the end?
Right. And my employer ServiceNow, we also have our own methodology. Yeah. So I think, yeah.
I'm not completely sure about actually the risk stuff you mentioned earlier, because we do it with the risks, because we say we have an impact on the assets, on the data that we can specify, and from the threats we can have the other part of the risk, how likely, the likelihood we can derive from there, and then can say we have risks and this is what we talk to our customers, and This is
But
quite popular.
that's because you already have a framework for risk management in place. You already
It's a very
have
small
those,
framework, yeah.
but you already have it. You already
Yeah.
have the probabilities of something occurring. You already have the impacts calculated.
Yeah.
Most people don't, and most people at this time not really there. That's not what they're looking for.
Yeah.
They are looking to know how bad is my design and what can I do to improve it.
Yeah. I mean, we must not have everything in there in step one anyway, so
Exactly.
we will start with the basics.
Sorry for the dogs barking in the background there. One other thing I think we should also mention, because we didn't talk about it in the PyTM demo, but right, there's different model types. You have data flow diagrams and you have sequence diagrams, and you
Yep.
can have attack trees, and you can have process diagrams or process flows. Right, PyTM only does data flows and sequence diagrams. That's what it's been currently programmed for. But other tools may support other model types, right? So whatever we come up with should have some ability to encode these different model types, because they provide different types of information when you're doing threat modeling.
Yeah,
right.
I agree. So yeah, because I mean, even we talked a little bit about out of scope, and that's not something we're supporting. We're supporting multiple scopes, so that your AppSec team and your network team and your privacy team, they can all be collaborating on the same model. The scope will be defined in the data, but they'll be able to look at the same model from their own perspectives. So out of scope, we're not supporting. We're supporting the definition of scopes. And part of that, I believe, is going to be like, again, if I'm looking at it from maybe an AppSec perspective, maybe I can have an attack tree defined in that particular scope, right? We did discuss diagramming and came to a conclusion that we're not doing that. We're going to be supporting all the data necessary to dynamically generate diagrams.
Agreed, and that's, I think that's a perfect way to think about this, right? PyTM, as an example, doesn't encode XY coordinates, right? It sends that to a renderer. The renderer figures that out. We just describe the objects and the interactions and let the renderer figure out where it lays on screen. I know OTM, for instance, has XY coordinates within, has some sort of Cartesian system within the model, which is too much, right? Because really you don't want to worry about layout when you're figuring that stuff out, right? On the question of scopes, so it sounds like you're looking at scopes for representation, or scopes for sort of who's the authority, or which group cares about which certain objects or things, as opposed to like a null scope where I want this object to be in my model from a documentation standpoint, but I don't care about it at all. Like it only lives there to be an anchor point.
Right, and you should be able to define that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of the point that we're doing. So, I mean, since we will have the ability to define multiple scopes, a null scope, or however we frame it, will be part of that. But objects can live in multiple scopes.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And that's probably a lot more advanced than what most threat modeling tools do today. But I've talked to Stephen DeVries about that. I actually have that requirement service now, right? We're trying to get everybody threat modeling. But out of scope doesn't work for it, because out of scope for the AppSec team is in scope for the network team, or the some other team, the privacy team, or whomever, right? Now you're being exclusionary, right? You're not being inclusive of everybody at the table. And if we're trying to get everybody to the same threat modeling table, out of scope is not I believe not the way to do that.
But you do have a reason. There is a valid reason for having an object again as a anchor, as opposed to an actual point of analysis. So
yeah, absolutely, completely agree. So it sounds like Izar is going to get this done in the next hour and forward it to me. So thank you, Izar. I appreciate that.
Hour? It's already now 45 minutes.
Oh, okay. We only have a couple minutes left. I thought today was a really good conversation. And thank you, Izar, for the demo. Thank you for the walkthrough. Really appreciate it. I think I understand the format a lot better than I did. So thank you for that. Does anybody have any last minute topics that they want to bring up today? Silence. All right. So thank you all. Hopefully by this time in what, 2 weeks, I think. Hopefully I will, fingers crossed, have something to show the community in terms of like a really, hey, this is my idea based on looking at PyTM and a bunch of the other tools. Here's how I think we can represent some of this data and use that as a starting point for further discussion. Sound like a plan?
Awesome.
Awesome. All right, cool. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. US folks, have a great Thanksgiving, and I'll talk to you all soon. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.